good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar. It's titled Digging Out Your Organization's Technical Debt. It's sponsored by Databee from Comcast Technology Solutions and broadcast by Informa. My name is Becky Bracken. I'm an editor with Dark Reading. I'll be your moderator for today, but we have just a couple of announcements before we begin. First of all, this webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn more about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and importantly, participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we're going to ask you to provide feedback via the survey widget, which is found at the bottom of your screen. If you could please take a minute to fill that out before leaving us today, we would very much appreciate it, as your feedback provides us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, you can click the Help widget at the bottom of your screen, or you can just type your issue into the Q&A window, and we will be glad to offer you one-on-one assistance. So with that, let's get right onto our presentation, Digging Out Your Organization's Technical Debt. Discussing today's topic is Roselle Safran, cybersecurity expert and entrepreneur, and Jill Cagliostro, Director 1, Product Management, Databee from Comcast Technology Solutions. If you'd like to learn more about our speakers, you can find their bios in the speaker bio widget on your screen. And again, if you want to ask any questions at any time throughout the presentation, just use that Q&A area that's on your right side of your screen. So with that, I would like to hand things over to Roselle. Roselle?
Thanks, Becky. Hello, everybody. Good to have you with us today as we talk about digging out your organization's technical debts. I'm guessing that many of you on this call have dealt with technical debt in one form or another. And today, Jill and I are going to be going back and forth with our slides and discuss this topic with you. So to get started, just want to give you a little info on my background. So I am the CEO and founder of Key Caliber. We are in the continuous threat exposure management space. Our product shows you, here are all your assets, here are the ones that are most critical, here are the ones most at risk, and here's how they're connected in the environment. Before Key Caliber, I was the CEO and co-founder of UpLevel Security, and that company was acquired by McAfee. Before that, I was in your shoes, a practitioner, and I was leading cybersecurity operations for the Executive Office of the President during the Obama administration. So defending the network used by the White House and the rest of the agency. And before that, I was at the Department of Homeland Security in the division that was then called US CERT and is now called CISA. And there I was leading malware and forensic analysis teams. So I'm coming at this topic from the perspective of lots of experience with the ins and outs and all the headaches. And I'll let Jill introduce herself here.
Thanks, Roselle. I'm Jill Cagliostro, Director of Product Management with Databee from Comcast Technology Solutions. And similar to Roselle, I also started out as a practitioner. I started out working for the parent company of the New York Stock Exchange, ICE. I ended up working in the threat intel space and ultimately ended up at Splunk, right, before coming to Databee. And I have been, I attended Georgia Tech, not once, but twice. I did my undergrad in computer science and ended up going back for a master's in cybersecurity. And so, digging yourself out of technical debt is both something I face as a practitioner and something I've come across time and time again, both in my schooling and in my job as a product manager, right? And the problems never seem to get easier. They only seem to grow as we continue to scale. And with that, I'll pass it back to Roselle to tell you a little bit about what kinds of technical debt we have.
All right, so let's take it from the top and discuss what technical debt is. So there are generally two forms of it. There is the intentional technical debt where you've decided, hey, we're going to take the shortcut right now and we're going to end up paying for it later. And then there's the unintentional technical debt where it's just an oversight, a mistake, or you're just being sloppy with your practices. And so you still end up in that situation of doing something now that you're going to pay for later. And there are plenty of examples of technical debt. So often when we think about it from the perspective of software development and the engineering team and the technical debt that they're accruing as they build. And so there are lots of examples of this. For example, poorly written code, just rushing along, getting sloppy, or nowadays using an LLM to produce some of your code. And then there's also the challenges with not updating libraries or frameworks, so it gets out of date, reduces vulnerabilities. There's also the duplicative code, which is just really inefficient and often hard to understand what's going on for someone that's new looking at it. There's the lack of documentation in code. And I know with engineers, the documentation side of it is never fun. No one wants to spend time on it, but it adds to confusion as the code base grows. And then there's also, in similar vein, not documenting the architecture, so you're not exactly sure how the different elements interact with one another. Similarly, on the infrastructure side, there are poor design choices. And sometimes it's just lack of information at the time, or sometimes it's the decision you make at the time because you think that's going to work, but you're not thinking in terms of scale later. And then similar to not updating libraries or frameworks, the applications, the operating systems, everything, if you're pegging it and trying to keep it consistent, then you run into challenges with it falling out of date quickly. And there's also the problem of duplicate functionality. So you end up doing something multiple times, adding a lot of inefficiencies. And not documenting the architecture is also a problem from an infrastructure perspective, as well as not documenting when there are exceptions. Sometimes people have it in their head of, oh, we're going to do it this way because we have to skip this for one reason or another, or we have to make sure that we handle this situation lightly. And if that's not documented, then the next person coming through might not know that and make some mistakes. Then in terms of both, if you're looking at it from the engineering perspective or more of the IT network infrastructure perspective, vulnerability patching, challenge across the board, and so often overlooked or just put to the side because it is such a production. Similarly, sometimes you just have to move quickly and you're not following the best practices, and that comes back to bite you later. And testing, all sorts of testing, unit testing, integration testing. There's plenty that can be done if you have the time and resources, but sometimes that ends up being shortchanged. And an issue that we see that ends up being a major security problem and also a tech debt problem is when values are hard-coded, because it's just easier to do that than create the variables and deal with it in a more abstract form. And we also have skipping error handling. So often you just want to get something done and you just want it to work. And you don't think about the fact of, hey, if it doesn't work, I want to know why it didn't work, so it's easier to troubleshoot it. And then finally, there's the challenge of technical debt that develops because when you're building, you're thinking of just getting it up and running, not thinking about it from a performance perspective of how it's going to scale and how it's going to grow. And that can lead to a lot of sluggishness and performance issues down the line. So lots of different types of technical debt, and it all adds to the challenges for the various teams.
Thanks, Roselle. And so if you may be wondering, well, why does this tech debt matter, right? Why is this a big problem beyond the obvious? Nobody wants to be in debt, right? But at the same time, the number of vulnerabilities that it's in this tech debt is continuing to grow, right? If you look at the number of vulnerabilities being disclosed every year, Last year alone, it was almost 27,000, and it's continuing to rise. And that's for a variety of reasons, right? We have more software, more applications than ever before. A lot of applications have moved to a SaaS-based approach where they're continuously releasing, which leads to more vulnerabilities, right? And not only is that bad from the obvious perspective, but it also creates more risk. These CVEs, these vulnerabilities that are being discovered, they are increasing, if you will, in terms of being able to be exploitable. And within the first day of publication, about 25% of high-risk CVEs are able to be exploited, and 75% are able to be exploited within 19 days of publication. So what that means is beyond the number of vulnerabilities increasing, there's a ton more ways for adversaries to get in, and there's opportunity, right, or examples of how to do it. So it's really at the adversary's, discretion of what to use next when you're not patching. And so this really builds to why is this so important? It's because the risk is greater than ever. We have more applications in every organization that are internet facing. The number of vulnerabilities are increasing, and the adversary's abilities to exploit them is also increasing. And so there should be, a high sense of urgency, if you will, not only to patch the latest systems, but also your legacy systems. There's been an uptick in previous years of adversaries exploiting vulnerabilities from a few years ago that were found to still be on the internet. And that's because they have easy directions of how to do it, and they're taking advantage, right? And so it's really important to take your tech debt seriously. And with that, I'll pass it back to Roselle.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, both the cause of tech debt and the cure, the ability to fix it, are all related to the big concepts that we hear about time and time again whenever we're talking about any form of a project. The people, the processes, the technology, and the data. Data is a newer one that gets added to that mix, and I distinguish that because it's really its own beast at this point. And so for many of the slides we're going to go through here, I'm going to be speaking more from the perspective of the people and the processes, and Jill will talk about it from the perspective of the technology and the data. So let's look at first from a people and processes standpoint, why organizations end up accruing technical debt. So big variable that affects all of us in our work life, and frankly, probably in our personal life as well, is time constraints and deadlines. So something has to get out in a certain amount of time. That's not negotiable. You have to take shortcuts to make sure it happens. Another big concern that most organizations feel all the time is you have budget constraints. So you're going to only have a finite number of resources for any task. And related to that is then your team size is constrained. And so sometimes that means that people just are overworked, and there's just a ton for them to try to cover in a short amount of time. And that also leads to tech debt. And when we're talking about it, particularly from an engineering standpoint, sometimes even from an infrastructure standpoint, there are customer demands, and the customer is going to be leaning and yelling and saying, hey, we need this done now. And so then that leads to deadlines, which also makes technical debt appear. And sometimes similar to that is there are unreasonable expectations about what can be done in a given amount of time with the given size of the team. And so then and if that's not properly articulated or not properly understood or not heard, even when it is articulated, then that leads to all of the problems associated with needing to take shortcuts to try to meet those expectations. Sometimes technical debt is also the result of lax management, either inexperienced management or management that's just not thinking about it from a best practices perspective. And so then that leads to just oversight, forgetting some of the basic hygiene perspectives, or documentation just gets tossed aside, and the like. And similarly, when often when there's lax management or lax enforcement of it, then there just aren't the proper procedures in place, the structure for going through a formal process, a formal Q&A process, a formal testing process that's just not followed. And finally, sometimes there are just inefficiencies within an organization where just can't get something done when it needs to get done. Vulnerability management is a clear example of that, where the security team is going to say, hey, we need to get this patched. And then for one reason or another, the team that's doing the patching just doesn't get to it. So lots of possibilities for why it occurs, just from a people and processes standpoint.
Yeah, and the technology doesn't make it any easier, right? So, why continue to struggle? Like, have you ever needed the data but chose the cost over storage, right? You just couldn't afford to keep it. Thought you had, all the data or missing data, and turns out it was just stored in a different field in a different data set. Or struggled with offboarding employees and assets are still assigned to them. So when you go to fix something, no one really knows who owns it now. Or, like Roselle mentioned, skipping the process to prioritize a deadline. But if technology made it easier to use, right, or even automated it for you, then these gaps wouldn't be created, right? And we took some of the pressure off of our employees. And so, we have these obvious people problems, if you will, that get created by technology being hard to use or interoperate even, right? Sometimes the data is there, but it's stored in system A and the other half is in system B. And how do you bring those records together in a way that makes sense and is useful for everyone, right? And along those lines, right, that technology creates data challenges. So most organizations have multiple sources of truth, right? You have your asset CMDB, you have your CMDB for assets, but often application or software is tracked separately. And then you have Active Directory or, some sort of identity platform that knows a lot about the users. And some of that may be in the CMDB, right? But it's, everyone, depending on which team you ask, they all trust one source over the other. It's something we experienced ourselves as well at Comcast. And then, not to mention, you have all these sources of truth floating around, and they all use a different log format. So one calls it host, one calls it host name, one calls it IP, one calls it source IP. And so it becomes very difficult to not only correlate across the different data sets, but also, to decide amongst teams, which standard do you go with? Because each standard is probably set by the team that owns it, which is likely different teams. So how do you work through those decisions? And then lastly, it'd be great if these things were static, because that would probably make it a little easier to keep track of it. Maybe we've only updated once a year. But the reality is, we're onboarding and offboarding employees every day. And with the cloud native world, as well as with the adoption of SaaS products, assets and applications change regularly, right? And then you have things that should be decommissioned that you thought were decommissioned, but you didn't know about that one instance, right? And so all of these data challenges make it really easy to incur tech debt because there is no real single source of truth right now. It's hard to gain that accuracy with all of the different methodologies and teams we have trying to work together. But don't worry, it gets better.
So let's just, I'm sure many of you have already experienced some of the consequences of having technical debt, but we'll just quickly go through them here. So some of them are that you just have inferior outcomes. The product doesn't work as well, the infrastructure doesn't operate as effectively, and you're just saddled with a problematic environment. And then, of course, from the perspective that we as security folks always look at it, there's inferior security. The security posture is not as strong as it can be, or in many cases, as it should be. And there are more vulnerabilities in the system, in the products, in the infrastructure, and the security posture is just lacking in many areas. Also, you end up, this is the big challenge with debt, and this is why it's called debt, because you're not paying now, you are paying later, and you are paying later in time and resources, because the problem doesn't go away, it just grows. And the complexity grows, so the time it takes to unravel it and fix it grows. And often that leads to needing to do a whole big refactoring. And it's something that if you're on a building team, you always groan about the thought of having to refactor anything, because it's always a long undertaking. And one of the other big areas that and this is often what brings to the attention the fact that you have tech debt, is that it becomes a blocker. You can't get something done that you want to get done because you've got this mess of a situation. A good example is you don't update your operating systems, so you have antiquated operating systems, and then you can't even get the right patching on it if it's end of life, for example. And so it becomes a real impediment to progress. And it's hard to get a hold of this and to take it on and make headways with unburying all of unburying the team from the technical debt for a variety of reasons. And a lot of them go back to the causes in the first place. You don't have a large enough team, or the team just doesn't have the experience, doesn't know how to do it properly, is overlooking something, or is just trying to move too fast and doesn't think about the process. Also, the inability to push back on unreasonable timelines and expectations really saddles lots of teams on the engineering side, on the infrastructure side. There's often just someone making demands, and from their perspective, the demand maker is making those demands because there is a valid business need. It's usually not coming out of nowhere, but the fact is that it's often making these promises that can't be fulfilled in a sustainable way. And then sometimes there's just, I call it the lack of will, where it's just, teams, they're just running fast, and they just don't care about the technical debt that they're accruing, because they are in the tactical phase of it. And all they can look at is the tactical situation. We can't take a step back and look at it more strategically to see how it's going to cause problems later. And then from a process standpoint, it's very common to just not have the proper procedures in place. Setting up an infrastructure and a framework for how to operate, it takes time and energy, and particularly if a company is growing fast or for some reason has to move very rapidly, that's just something that falls by the wayside. Similarly, if there's just not the right technical capabilities, so you don't have the tools, you don't have the technology to do it well, and so you can't incorporate that into your procedure, and then you get stuck with lots of manual procedures, and then you really lead to a lot of lack of will. And also, when this last bullet point is something that I harp on quite a bit, and this is the ability to incorporate the business criticality into the process, into the decision-making process. This is something that we often find lacking in engineering, and particularly in security, where we're not looking at it from the lens of what does the business really need? What does the business really care about? And is this going to move the business forward? And so that's something that Key Caliber really focuses on, and I talk about it all day long, about how you need to always be a business enabler, and you can enable when you know what's critical to the business. Now, from the technology perspective.
Yeah, from the technology perspective, right? It's expensive is the first thought that comes to mind. In order to get a grasp on your tech debt, you have to be able to assess it, which can be an overwhelming scope, right? Where do you start? And then when you start getting into it, you realize you have persistent data silos. You have all of this data living in different places, and it's hard to bring it together. And then as you grow your business, you have more assets, which creates more data, right? And so we have an unmanaged data explosion, and all of this leads to very high cost at the end of the day, both from actually using your tools to process and use this data, but also from a people perspective, right? It takes a lot of man hours to approach these problems. And so it can start to feel a little overwhelming. And with that, it's not just from a technology perspective, there's also data challenges that, prevent the efficient management of tech debt. We mentioned earlier, being able to not having a single source of truth. Well, often that problem includes not being able to figure out who's responsible for a particular application or server. Because at the end of the day, if you have a vulnerability or you need to address, someone has to go and patch that server or take an intervention step. And if you can't find the person responsible, how do you do that? How do you track down the business owner, which may be different than the person responsible for patching, to confirm, would there be business impact? Can we update this? All of these things create huge barriers, right, that make it really hard to handle these problems at scale. Not to mention the shadow IT, the devices that one team stood up for that proof of concept and forgot about and never reported, or the app owner who moved teams or left the company and now they don't know who manages it. I mean, there are a million different situations where most enterprises find themselves in daily, and your team spend a lot of man hours going and tracking down those people the old-fashioned way by just asking around, hey, do you own this? I see you use it, right? And then we have a lot of overstated risk, which can make it hard to know what to prioritize. Often, vulnerability findings or, patching things will remain there even after the patch has been done. The reason being the IP gets decommissioned, or the host on that IP got decommissioned. Maybe it was a Windows box one day and Linux the next. And all those Windows vulnerabilities probably aren't being closed automatically, right? Which creates a lot of noise. And noise makes it hard to focus. And so we've had a lot of these problems, and that's just predominantly with network-based scanning for vulnerabilities, right? Agent-based, be a little bit more accurate. And then lastly, the fear of the unknown. In theory, your vulnerability management solution should be scanning your infrastructure and helping you keep track of your tech debt, right? But a lot of times there's unknown blind spots in scan coverage. You think everything's being scanned, but you forgot about that router or firewall update that went in that's actually been blocking the scans for 6 months, right? A lot of times it's hard to find those kinds of human errors that happen all the time. The other thing that also happens with unknown blind spots is vulnerability management was configured with a list of do not scan, right? But those IPs that were previously development and in that list, now they're production. It's hard to keep track of all of these different configurations and different tools and know, am I really aware of my full scope of my tech debt, right? With confidence.
So we talked a lot about some of the challenges, why we have them, and how they cause headaches. Let's get a little prescriptive about how we can make some headway in addressing the technical debt. So first off, you want to be aligned with the stakeholders, and depending on the situation, what type of technical debt you have, there could be a variety of stakeholders. So often engineering and IT are involved. Ideally, security is also in that mix. But sometimes you have various other groups as well. So if it is related to a product capability, you might have the product team or the sales team or the marketing team. And depending on what's happening, there could be a need to incorporate legal or privacy, particularly if there is personally identifiable information involved in the data that you're working with. And then sometimes there are just demands and requests and needs that come from leadership. And it could be as simple as, hey, we need to restrict our AWS bill, or it's we need to expand into X in this short amount of time. And so the first step is having the proper stakeholders involved, particularly when you're setting up those procedures, and making sure that you have the right buy-in with it. And now I'm going to talk a bit about weighing which technical debt item to take on first. Because for most organizations, it's not just one piece of tech debt. It is a whole slew of them of all different varieties. And then it becomes a big challenge to prioritize. So there are a couple of key factors to always consider when you're weighing what type of technical debt to make headway in reducing. First off is the importance of whatever you're working on. Is this something that is being required by a customer or an auditor or some other third party that has the ability to make those demands and say jump, and you have to say how high? Second key indicator of how important it is whether it affects stability or performance. This directly relates to the usability of the product. Another key factor, of course, we all know, security. And depending on your organization, the importance level of security may vary, but there will always be an element of needing to focus on security and cyber risk. And then fourthly, from the perspective of engineering productivity, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how you end up with blockers from the tech debt. Well, that affects the productivity of the team if they can't move forward with something. And so that can lead to it being ranked more important. The flip side of it is looking at, all right, well, if I do nothing right now, because for one reason or another, that's an option and I can't just tackle it right now, then you have to look at it from the perspective of, is this going to increase the complexity of the problem exponentially and compound the debt? Or is this going to make customers really unhappy and create churn? Or is the security exposure going to increase to an unacceptable level? Or will the engineering team just not really be able to function properly because there's this big blocker in its way? And then the third big area to focus on is the level of effort. And I include this because, sometimes there are just these quick little items. They don't take a lot of time and they can just keep you moving forward, and it's just worth it to knock them out. But sometimes you have these tech debt problems that are going to take weeks or months to deal with, and that has to be factored in when you're deciding what you're going to work on. And similarly, the constraints of the team and the team's capabilities and the team's time and the size of the team, that needs to be factored in when thinking about how much work is actually involved. And then when you have those three factors squared away, then you can really start to prioritize, where you're incorporating all of those elements. And ideally, you're using some sort of consistent, at least quasi-empirical system. Maybe you're giving it a score of 1 to 10 in each of these categories, just an example. But you have some way of being able to rank and then prioritize. And then you can start to look at your action items from the perspective of, well, this tech debt item, this is far more crucial than anything else based on these factors involved.
And so let's, talk a little bit more about solutions, right? So we at DataB, and a little bit about our origin story. DataB is a security data fabric that was originally built to solve an internal Comcast problem, right? Our CISO, Newbert Davis, with all the security tools in the world, all the building blocks, couldn't quite put them together to solve problems like security hygiene, keeping track of all of your users, your devices, and who owns them, right? And so what we at DataB enable you to do is take these steps to be able to get to squeaky clean security hygiene, right? First, standardizing your data. We map and normalize everything to the Open Cybersecurity Framework, OCSF, which is a logging standard that was put out by AWS, Splunk, and Symantec Broadcom as well. And so it's widely accepted in industry, and we do the hard part of normalizing the data for you, right? So you just turn it on and it works. CMDB data, vulnerability management data, and it will auto map and start learning and enhance your inventory using our patent pending entity resolution, right? That learns from the telemetry data you stream through our system. And then we help you clean up the gaps. We'll suggest owners for orphaned assets or shadow IT, right? Devices that don't have an owner based on who's authenticating to it to make it a little bit easier to approach solving the problem, right? And so what you can see here are, screenshots from our DataB portal where you can see the overview of devices in your organization, suggested owners, and then a drill down of what that looks like. And if we also realize that not everyone wants to be in a new portal, so we offer things like Tableau dashboards to help you visualize this data. And so with that, how do we power this? What does this look like? And so from a high level, the architecture essentially is you stream in your data, whatever you want, right? From security events to network logs to IT solutions to organizational hierarchies. We'll normalize it and parse it all to the OCSF framework, and then we'll land the data in your data lake, Snowflake, Databricks. That way you have full autonomy. We essentially serve as a transformation and analytics layer, allowing you to shift your analytics left, right? And we can bring in business context as well in that streaming architecture. And this unlocks a variety of use cases. My personal favorite are the security-centric ones because my background is as a SOC analyst. So things like insider threat hunting or threat detection, right? SIM optimization. They like to joke, get the junk out of Splunk. But we also can help with things like continuous controls monitoring, right? Being aware of how widely deployed your controls are and are they meeting your targets? Everyone wants EDR on every endpoint. But like Roselle mentioned earlier, there's always that exception for that one reason. And that's okay, as long as you're documenting it and tracking it, right? And so this allows you to start to get more value out of your data. We mentioned earlier that data silos are one of the challenges that we face with assessing organizational technical debt and all of those different logging formats and how do you pick one. This gives you a way to offer a solution, right? Because we've already picked the format for you. And the hardest part of picking a format is doing the normalization because it's time consuming and those logs are going to change and then the standards change. And then someone has to go update all of that. Then you have to go to your dashboards and all of the downstream operations as well. But if all of the logging normalization's handled for you, it makes it a little bit easier to have those conversations and start to move towards the security data fabric approach. And so with that, back to Roselle.
Yeah. So, we talked a little bit about, assessing the debt and some strategies on what type of technology works for that, DataB being a great example. Now I'm just going to touch upon a little bit some of the just standard processes and people perspectives to take into take into consideration when you're trying to come up with a way of handling tech debt long term. So first off, and this goes back to what Jill was talking about, aggregating everything into one spot. And you don't need you don't need multiple sources of truth. Then it's not a single source of truth. And you don't need the team doing swivel chairs and going all over the place to try to get the data that's needed. So having all the information about the technical debt, the assessment of it, and the priority levels in one spot allows for a very clean view of what's going on and what needs to be tackled. And then when it comes to what bubbles up to be a high priority, the next step is to often build a plan, because the majority of the time when you're talking about tech debt, it's not just well, we can just get this done really quickly. There are some cases with that, in which case you can say, great, let's just knock this out. But often it's a bigger project. And we talk about it from the standpoint of it's a big rock and you need to break it up into little rocks. And so there needs to be a process for taking the time where you say, you know, we've got this big tech debt issue. It's been lingering for a while, and we need to make some decisions on it. So we're going to have to set aside time, get the right people at the table, and talk through this problem and come up with some answers and come up with some plans. Also, to the extent possible, automate everything. And there are technologies that work in a variety of forms for all types of testing, unit testing, integration testing, performance testing. You have linters and formatters for when you're just writing the code itself. And of course, there are plenty of vulnerability scanners, some of which can do automated remediation if you allow it to. And there are also products that can do orchestration to automate. To the extent possible, bring those into the fold. Now, obviously, there are going to be times when they're going to be too costly, or there's going to be a concern around making something automated, and someone maybe still needs to be in the loop to say, yes, now kick off this automated process. But to the extent that you can get that data going automatically or get that process kicked off automatically, that makes the whole side of it more efficient. And then finally, like with any process, it's going to morph over time, because your environment's going to change, your people are going to change, your needs are going to change. And so all of the processes and procedures, they have to be living documents where you're iterating on them and recognizing that what may have worked a year ago might not be suitable for right now, and you adjust to the times. And I'll turn it back over to Jill.
And speaking of automation, right? We at DataBee just announced our Beekeeper AI that can manage your hive so you can focus on making honey out of your data. Sorry, I'm a product manager and I came up with that tagline myself, so I was pretty excited about it. But what it is, right, is a generative AI chatbot that integrates into your organization's chat client, typically Teams, and will reach out to the DataBee suggested owners to verify, hey, do you own this, right? And if not, it will even take feedback. So if I don't own it, but I know who does, I can tell Beekeeper AI, and it will reach out to them and ask them. And so what this enables your organization to do is really scale solving some of these problems, right? You no longer have a single person trying to track down owners of, 10 or even 1,000 assets. You can let AI do the work for you. And, as someone who used to be the person trying to track down owners of assets, right, it can sometimes lead to frustration between teams and make it difficult to work together. But by using AI or a chatbot, it allows there to be a little bit less friction between these teams. Because now it's the chatbot that's bothering everyone, not you as an individual person. And so with that, you get a lot of benefits by moving to a security data fabric approach, whether it be with DataBee or as an overall architecture approach, right? It helps take the sting out of growing data challenges. Got to work in my benefits or benefits. My puns all over. But essentially, by bringing all this data together, it helps complement your CMDB by augmenting your CMDB with things like directory service, vulnerability scanners, telemetry data from your network and endpoints. And while these services sometimes integrate directly, again, we go back to that normalization problem, right? Where they're speaking different languages. By leveraging the data fabric, we're able to normalize that all into the same language. And with that, we can reduce the man hours to gather that very important business context that Roselle was talking about earlier, right? Which allows you and add it into your CMDB as well as into your reviews when you're looking at events. So you have that context without having to swivel chair to different screens. And then we can help you find your gaps. You can automate discovering things like shadow IT and orphaned assets from your telemetry data. So you don't have to do a manual review once a year trying to process all of that information. And then lastly, helping you fill the gaps with suggested owners from DataBee and then validation with Beekeeper AI. With the intent to be to make your source of truth more truthful, right? We want to feed this information back into the CMDB of choice. So that way everyone's operating on the same information, right? And so if this feels a little overwhelming, it's okay, right? It's a journey. It takes time. Most organizations, right? And something like DataBee can help you accelerate through this model, through this process. But from our perspective, right, stage one is being aware. You may not have a strong data management strategy. There's a little bit of data silos. Every team kind of does their own thing, but you have all the on-demand reporting that you need and you're meeting all your compliance check marks. And then as you evolve, you move to more of a reactive stage where maybe you've started to break down some of those silos. Maybe two of the teams have started to be friends and sharing data sources, but not quite all of them. But security data often remains segmented in this phase. It's usually left on its own. And it takes significant effort on data manipulation to be able to do cross-functional reporting, really. And this is where a lot of organizations tend to live, if you will. It's a little bit tricky here. And here's where organizations tend to decide build versus buy, right? In between stage 2 and 3 and 3 and 4. By stage 3, maybe you've got some data warehousing going on, but your data is still not clean enough to unlock that ML machine learning approach that you really want. You're starting to look into it, but it's tricky because the most important thing to be able to do AI or machine learning against your own data is that it's clean, that it's consistent, that you know it's in your data. And that is really hard when you're using multiple schemas with data all over the place, right? Or even when your data started to get into a warehouse, if you haven't selected a single standardized schema, it can still be tricky. And then once we get all that data connected, right, and you start to move to stage 4, this is where you have a lot of your benefits start to really unlock. When your data starts to be able to not only be in the same place and be normalized, but bring in that business context because of it. Right? You can start to automate your data infrastructure and your pipelines instead of having, a team of 5 or 10 or however many it is in your company managing this data, just moving through your organization to log management solutions, databases, wherever it needs to go. And then nirvana, where we're all trying to get to, right? Where we can do prescriptive analytics powered by AI and ML, where we have a global data strategy, where we have the ability to augment cybersecurity workflows with trusted AI and ML that's got guardrails around it and that's transparent, right? The ability to run searches against historical data. While the average dwell time of a breach may be going down because of ransomware, which often reveals itself quickly, APTs often still have a long dwell time. They often aren't caught for 3 to 6 months, even up to a year of being in your environment. And being able to run, searches historically against that data once you're more aware of something going on has always been the goal. But traditionally, you have to reload the data into a solution, wait for it to be reprocessed, renormalized, and then run your searches. But in the security data fabric approach, you can have the answers to those questions in near real time, as fast as you can build your queries and figure out what you want to ask. And that's my favorite thing about a security data fabric. Once you bring all the data together and it's normalized, you really can answer any question. The biggest question becomes, what do you want to ask? And so getting back to closing it out with one of Roselle's points is that it really comes back to people and process at the end of the day, right? Can help you operationalize it to make it more efficient and effective. And with that, thank you. So our contact info is on the screen. I can be reached at LinkedIn, or if you want to learn more about DataBee, check out databee.buzz.
Thank you so much, Jill and Roselle. We very much appreciate that deep dive on this topic. I learned a lot. I know our audience did as well. Before we begin today's Q&A, I just wanted to one more time draw your attention to the webinar survey, which is available at the bottom of your presentation window. We appreciate you filling that out. Thanks in advance. Your participation in the survey allows us to improve future events. So let's get right on to our Q&A. We have a couple of really good questions in here I'd like to talk about. Jeffrey asks, how could an organization determine if they are in debt or building debt if it is not noticed? Now, I know we kind of covered this, but perhaps we can speak directly to this. We can start with Roselle and then move over to Jill. Roselle?
That's a good question. And sometimes you don't know right away. And sometimes you think you're making a good decision and that it's not going to lead to technical debt. And then down the line, the situation changes for whatever reason. So sometimes it's not apparent right away. There are times where you're making a design decision or an architectural decision and you know it's not ideal, but you just have to go with it for the time being, in which case then it's noticed and you can document it. But if it's not, then often it ends up becoming noticed when it rears its ugly head as a blocker. And so that's when you get to the point where you realize, we have a challenge on our hands because I can't do X because this old issue that we didn't even know was an issue is now standing in the way of it. And so there are going to be times where you identify it the hard way, and that's when it becomes an obstacle. But there are other times where you will have that foresight and you realize, I know I'm taking a shortcut here, or you may know I'm taking a shortcut. I don't know exactly what that's going to mean down the line in terms of tech debt, but I know there's going to be some of it.
Jill, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I would say that the most important thing is start trying to track it, even if it feels overwhelming, right? And the metrics may move because you may learn about more tech debt as you start trying to measure it, but at least you've started somewhere. It's a journey, and making small incremental steps, being able to get a handle on your tech debt, understand the business impact, and prioritize based on that. It's not just about also, the impact of the business, but also the likelihood of exploit. If it's a low-level vulnerability or issue that's on a server that's completely isolated on the network, probably not something as urgent as something on production that's externally facing that, a known attacker has exploited previously. I think once you start to write down what's important to your organization and build a plan towards getting there, it feels a lot less overwhelming.
Jeffrey had a follow-up question, which I think is very good. And how will you see the progress? How will that, change things around you? Either if you're going the correct way on the spectrum toward driving down your debt, or if you're increasing. Sort of, what are some of the symptoms, if you will, that you will start to see bubbling up around you? Roselle?
Well, certainly when you're unblocked, then and you can start to accelerate your movement in whatever direction you're trying to go in. Then you know that you've really gotten a hold on that issue. And sometimes it's more of looking at it from the viewpoint of security and just assessing the risk level. And I know there's another question or two on that, so we'll tackle that in a second. But sometimes you're going to see your progress because your security posture has improved, your cyber risk level has decreased. So it depends on the type of debt that you're talking about, how you can see whether it's moving in the right direction or not. There are times where it just kind of compounds unless you can start to dig out from under it. And there are times where even when you start to dig out from under it, there's still going to be more that comes on top of it. So the reality is, for many organizations, you're never going to get to the point where you can say, hey, no tech debt, we're ready to roll. It's more of just gradually trying to chip away at it and just prioritizing based on what's going to move the ball forward the best.
Jill, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, to add to that, most tech debt, most organizations start to care about it or really prioritize it once there's a vulnerability associated with it, right? And most organizations have SLAs on response times for getting that vulnerability resolved once it's over a certain criticality threshold. And so one of the key indicators of progress, if you will, good or bad, is those SLA times. Are you seeing that your teams are able to meet them? If not, how much are you missing by, right? One of the other things that I recommend tracking, and we track at Comcast with our Vulnerability Insights module, is how many times are tickets reassigned, right? I like to think of that as like the hot potato assigned to remediate that vulnerability. There's no way you're going to hit your SLA. And so those can be some of the indications that you may have an inventory or asset issue that's worthy of addressing to help improve that process.
In these last few minutes we have, I do want to get to this question from Mike about technical debt's relation to risk, and also whether CISA or NIST reference this in any of their frameworks. I know that this is a much deeper subject than the last 3 minutes we have will allow, but perhaps you could just sort of skim the surface for us, Roselle and Jill.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, it depends on the type of technical debt. So if we're talking about something like vulnerabilities or upgrading old operating systems or end of life operating systems, then there is cyber risk involved with it. If we're talking about engineering and it's, hey, we need to go from a Postgres database to a graph database, then risk may not be the main factor involved in the decision-making process. But when you're talking about anything related to vulnerabilities, to coverage, to security controls around it, then absolutely it does weave into the risk. And that's where you want to look at it from the perspective of the likelihood. So the vulnerability, the exploitability, et cetera, and also the impact. Like, does this cause a problem to the business?
Jill, we'll give you the last word on this.
Roselle really hit the nail on the head there. Right, like she mentioned, there's different kinds of tech debt, and while NIST and CISA are very, very helpful, highly recommend the CISA KEV list, known exploit vulnerabilities list. But there are things that fall outside of it, like going from Postgres to a graph database, exactly like Roselle said. And so you have to be able to track both kinds of tech debt as an organization, which can lead to trickiness, if you will.
Thank you both. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time together today. But for those of you who submitted questions, I want to let you know those will be provided to our experts here offline so they can respond to you and get your questions answered. I want to thank both Roselle and Jill for your time and your deep expertise on today's topic. Dark Reading is very grateful. We also want to thank our sponsor, DataBee from Comcast Technology Solutions, as well as everyone in the audience. We very much appreciate your attention and your participation. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who might not have been available to listen to the event. This webinar is copyright 2024 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and DataB from Comcast Technology Solutions, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of our guests, DataB from Comcast Technology Solutions, I'm Becky Bracken. Thanks so much for your time, and I hope everybody has a great day. We'll see you at a future Dark Reading event.